Well, Jim Farley recently posted an op-ed, an opinion editorial, on X in which he stated, "As a lifelong petrolhead, I was as surprised as anyone when I fell in love with electric vehicles." He went on to say, quote, "I guess from my perspective it's time to really take a step back and reflect on what it's like to actually drive an electric vehicle, not for the save the planet part, but everything else. The actual human experience of driving an electric vehicle is wonderful. I'm totally converted, and I don't know why we're all stuck talking about these vehicles as if all they really do is have no carbon footprint." What really convinced me of why we should invest in EVs on a personal level is because the experience of driving past the gas station, of effortless acceleration on the highway, or passing someone, or decelerating without using the brakes. End quote. And he finished with, and I quote directly, 95% of Americans would have no problem living with an EV and not really having to charge on the road, very often with home charging. End quote. But what about the other 5%? What choices do they have? Oh, by the way, I've copied links to this original op-ed entitled "Confessions from a Petrolhead" and the NBC interview entitled "Ford CEO Jim Farley discusses the rapid evolution of electric vehicles" in the description down below. For those who think I'm actually making any of this up, I'm not. Well, I'm Dave. Welcome to Dave Takes It On. Jim Farley is now a converted EV fanatic. Indeed, he states that unless we transition to EVs, Ford might not make it. Wow! He covers the slow adoption rate by saying, "I remember when mobile phones seemed to be just for doctors and stockbrokers, when computers were just for NASA, when the internet was a fad, and CDs lined my truck's visor. It takes time for innovations to take off, but when they do, the shift is profound and lasting." End quote. But in the subsequent NBC interview, he covers the small percentage for whom EVs are not the answer and raises the idea of biofuels or carbon-friendly biofuels. He's wrong. So let's have a look at that, because for the vast majority of drivers, they seem to have a really short memory bordering on amnesia. We'll start by quoting what Jim Farley actually said. So what is clearly happening is partial electric is the way to go for high performance. So I think that what you're going to see is this is a vehicle that's digital, partially electric, where you use the full acceleration for electric, but with regenerative power to repower it with a petrol engine. I would argue even synthetic fuel, man-made fuel. We're starting to mess around with that. Most of the racing series are going to low carbon or zero carbon man-made fuel. Now Formula One will go in 2026. So you're going to see a lot of experimentation in performance applications with low carbon fuel from a petrol engine producing electricity. And then digital control the whole vehicle. So you control the damping, the brake bias. You control everything from your phone. So I, for example, want the maximum setting for my Mustang or 911. And that's going to happen soon. I think that's the future. And we shouldn't be scared of that, because it's going to be as exciting as an electric vehicle. It's just a little different than what we thought it was going to be just a couple of years ago. That's end quote. Okay, first point. People quote zero carbon or carbon neutral fuels or low carbon, but they all include the word carbon. The only fuels that produce no carbon at all are renewable. The sun, wind, tide. None of these, when used to produce electricity for use in an electric vehicle, produce any carbon at all. Zero. In electricity production, storage, or to drive the vehicle. Zero. Yes, I know that carbon is produced in making those PV panels and turbines and the batteries and chargers, but so too when you make petrol engines, or cars, or tractors, or ships to transport the finished fuels and biofuels. And what about food? We release over 1% of the world's CO2 by just ploughing the fields. So first point, Jim here does specify this is for maximum performance or high performance vehicles, not for everyday use. Remember, 95% of Americans could happily drive an EV with no problems. But that still leaves the 5%. And in theory, that 5% could switch to synthetic or biofuels, which he states are low carbon or zero. Which here I do take the greatest issue. Biofuels and synthetic fuels are not zero carbon or low carbon. They are at the very best carbon neutral, but most are definitely nowhere near carbon neutral. See, zero carbon energy is a solar panel or wind turbine, where nature provides the power, sun or wind, and the device just converts that power directly into electricity. Carbon neutral or low carbon simply means that the plants that grow the biofuel absorb CO2 while growing in roughly equal quantities to the CO2 that is released when that fuel is burned. But it never does. It doesn't do it ever. That's a huge lie. First of all, as we mentioned, ploughing the field to prepare for the crop releases huge quantities of CO2, 3 tonnes per hectare. It's only about 2.5 acres. Then there's the fertiliser, which is an energy-intensive process and produces about 1.5% of the world's CO2 annually. Plus, look at the tractors and the harvesters running on fossil fuel, having to be built. All these are totally ignored by the supporters of biofuels or synthetic fuels. Or in the case of biodiesel, it's the clearing of the rainforest to make way for huge commercial scale palm oil farms. Does nobody remember the outcry when the Malaysians and Indonesians began clearing their rainforests? I certainly do. Or the rainforest in Brazil cleared to make way for growing crops for producing ethanol to replace petrol, or should I say, replace a small percentage of petrol. No Brazilian vehicles currently run on 100% ethanol. A very small number run on hydrous ethanol, being 95% ethanol, the rest is water, but the overwhelming huge majority run on E20 or E25, that's mostly petrol, but up to 25% ethanol. The reason? Ethanol, a manufactured biofuel, is simply too dear to use. They can't afford it. So bio or synthetic fuels are not a perfect answer anywhere in the world, and that will get significantly worse in the coming years. As the global temperature rises, which it is doing no matter who or what you choose to blame, the amount of arable land available for growing crops for food is already shrinking. Large areas of arable land in Asia and Africa have been lost. Coffee is a classic example. As the globe heats up, the equatorial arable land required for growing coffee beans is moving away from the equator and encroaching into land currently used for growing food crops. Should we be growing coffee beans at all? It's a luxury after all, when the land is desperately needed for food crops to stave off famines. That's an essential. The answer is that money talks, and there's probably more profit in coffee than in crops, so guess who's going to win? Our arable land is already shrinking, and the motor industry's answer is to grow more non-food crops on land previously used to growing food to power our cars. Can anyone guess why? Well, those crops are actually optimised for making ethanol or biodiesel. In plain English, the best crops for making fuel are ones that just don't waste any energy at all making any edible product. The environmental bit they quote is, well, the plants themselves can be dried and then burned as a biomass fuel to produce electricity. Well, that CO2 is never included in the biofuel calculation. Well, one statistic might bring this home to you is that the area of tropical land required to produce 1.2% of Europe's road fuel for transport is about 1/4 the size of Belgium. That's 3.2 million tonnes of palm oil. And biofuels and biodiesel, which are supposedly better, aren't when you add in the land for ploughing, fertiliser usage. They're actually shown now to be 3 times worse than using fossil fuels. So could the 5% switch to bio or synthetic fuels? Well, almost certainly not. The only reason that fossil fuels are so cheap is that they are very heavily subsidised and well into mass production. If 95% of the drivers do actually switch to electric, that leaves a very tiny market for biofuels, meaning the price will be simply horrendous. Just look at Brazil. They've got millions of people driving around on E25, but very few or virtually none on pure ethanol. It's too dear. Or look at hydrogen in Europe. It's a very niche fuel. The Hyundai Nexus in the UK is quoted by Autocar as costing £11.40 to fill up enough with hydrogen to cover 100 kilometres, 62 miles, while a petrol car would cost £7.11 and a diesel £5.81. These are based on 2022 prices. It's much dearer today. But the real killer is down to two facts. First, there are less than 200 hydrogen-powered cars on the roads in the UK. And less than 15,000 in the whole world. And even that is a drop of 30% compared to how many were on the road in 2022. And most of them are in Japan. Oh, the idea of anyone building out a nationwide UK network of hydrogen fueling stations for 200 cars is at best laughable, in reality ludicrous. In truth, the opposite is happening. Existing stations have been shutting down over the last few years, leaving less than a dozen in the whole of the UK. Even in Japan they've been shutting down. Total today has dropped to just 161, although they now predict a rise of new stations to around 300 by 2025. Not much time left for that, 6 months. But the second fact is the decider. The cheapest hydrogen-powered car on sale today, and there are only 2 in the UK, 3 in the whole world. One is priced at 65,000, the other between 65 and 72,000. And you lot complain loudly and violently about EVs being priced at 30,000, being way too dear to catch on. How many of you will be dashing out and buying a replacement hydrogen fuel cell car at £65,000? Not many, no, that's for sure. No, hydrogen's not an answer nor are biofuels. But one thing baffles me. That is, why are we so keen to buy any car that forces you to rely on someone else making the fuel for you and selling it at a very high profit? Less than half the price you pay for your petrol is fuel, and that itself already includes the profit, distribution and everything from the oil giants. The rest is taxes and duty that go to the government and a little bit for supermarket markup. That can change tomorrow if OPEC meets up and decides they're not making enough profit out of you. Are you really happy with that? Are you really? So many viewers now generate their own electricity at zero cost once they have the necessary equipment. Most of the others choose cut price, overnight, cheap rate electricity, guaranteed to be green, and they charge at home where there's no fuel duty at all. VAT is just 5%. So many viewers comment that as soon as it becomes popular, the government will dramatically increase prices. There's more chance of being bitten by a lettuce when you see the public reaction when prices did actually increase dramatically just a few years ago. Dare I mention, back then we gave government subsidies and price caps to try and get over it. That's quite the opposite to boosting prices. Well, the 5% who believe they cannot use EVs are not seeing any really easy and quick solutions in the near future. It is far more likely that their answers will be an improved EV. If technology marches on, we'll soon be able to see EVs with a range of 1,000 miles and a recharge time of around 10 minutes. But you and I will never ever buy one of those. We just don't need one. See, on a typical journey for us normal drivers, we rarely ever drive far enough to empty the battery on a single trip. Very rarely. Maybe a holiday, maybe a visit to a distant relative in Scotland or Cornwall. That's it. Once, twice a year. Most people poodle around locally doing 10 or 20 mile a day with an odd trip out at the weekend to the country or the beach or the retail park and doing maybe 100 mile or so that day. All of that is easily in the range of even the cheapest EV on the road today. That means charging once a week. Would you go out and buy an EV with a massive battery in it costing maybe £10,000 more than the standard model just for those few trips a year? That would be like saying, well, I'm going to go out and buy a 14-seater minibus as my normal car because once a year or every other year we have a family get together and we could use those 14 seats on that one day. The reality is 95% of the UK driving population, a range currently available 300 mile, is perfectly adequate and affordable. If you look at it, top 10 UK best ICE car sellers this year, none of them cost more than £30,000. Many EVs now fall below the 30,000, some down to 20,000, with several more being released later this year. Now, some people will want the 1,000-mile range. It's a very, very small, minute number, mainly because the law states you must get a lunch break of at least 20 minutes if you work for more than 6 hours a day. And this cannot be taken before or after work, has to be taken during it. If you don't work 6 hours in a day, how far can you actually drive? Even at a constant 70 mile an hour, it's only just over 400 miles. More realistically, with traffic, it's going to be less than 300. And for those doing more than 6 hours work in a day, you are legally entitled to a 20-minute break, and the modern cars can easily add up to 200 miles in that time. So even in a 10-hour working day, doing 70 mile an hour, you can't cover more than 700 miles. So let's cut out the false lies, the media hysteria, get real. The average white van man drives less than 15,000 miles a year with a 5-day week. That's 288 miles a week. Not a day, that's a week. Check the leasing companies and the used van sales and the auctions. 300 miles a week is average. And you get hysterical about needing a van that can cover 1,000 miles in a day without having to charge? Are you crazy? Have you never looked at your actual mileage? Go out right now, stop the video, take an odometer reading and then divide that by the age of your vehicle. Or go and look at your present and last MOT certificates. If you can't find them, you can get your actual mileage online. I consider I do a lot of miles, yet my MOT shows less than 15,000 miles a year. Got a comment from Chris recently who said they do 25,000 miles a year, as if that was huge. That is still only 2 charging sessions a week, 500 miles a week. We need to get real. The sad truth is that you have been conned and lied to and manipulated by the media. I suspect the average white van man or rep on the road covers less than 300 miles a week, and the average rep on the road, don't forget I was one, does less than 50,000 miles a year, or 1,000 miles a week. Not a day, that's a week. I really would like to hear from anyone who can realistically prove that they cover anywhere near 1,000 miles a day regularly. Let's face it, at a constant 70 mile an hour, which is an impossibility, you could only cover 1,680 miles. That's non-stop, no toilet break, no lunch break, no sleep at all. You cover 1,680 miles. And nobody in the world will ever have travelled 1,680 miles in the UK at a constant speed of 70 miles an hour. That's John Groton back twice. Many of us are lucky to average 60 miles an hour on the motorway, and all of us get stuck in heavy traffic at some time. No, I'm afraid you've fallen for the cons and lies of the oil giant media onslaught. 99% of all drivers will never drive more than 300 miles without stopping, and at that stop, most modern cars can replace 200 miles in just 20 minutes. And few of us stop for less than 20 minutes after a 5-hour long drive. Oh, let's go back to what Jim Farley said about American drivers. I suspect about 95% of the drivers anywhere in the world, not just America, would have no problem living with an EV, not really having to charge on the road very often with home charging. Yes, the 5% are lucky at the moment, but many of them just need a reality check. If you are a high mileage driver, then buy or lease an EV that has the bigger battery, the longer range, and the faster charging speed. If you charge up before you set off for your day's driving, you stop once, that's good for well over 500 miles every single day. And 500 miles every single day works out at over 150,000 miles a year. I bet there aren't more than a handful of people in the UK that cover 150,000 miles a year in their private car. I really definitely would love to hear from you if you do. Well, for the rest of you, cut the hype. Do a simple basic bit of calculation and find out your actual weekly miles covered. And again, I'd be very surprised if there are more than a few thousand motorists doing more than 1,000 miles a week. I was a rep for many years and I only managed 30 to 40,000 a year. It was about 600 to 800 a week, nowhere near 1,000. That would have meant just 2 charging sessions per week, not per day. Not having to stop in the middle of the day. 2 charging sessions per week. And those could easily have been completed in 2 lunch breaks during the week. 2. Get real. I'm Dave. Thanks for watching.